Hello, you're watching Broadcasting Scotland. This is Scotland at 7 on Tuesday the 31st of May with Hugh Stewart in the Glasgow studio, and we have Marion Fellows in Wishaw. Marion Fellows MP is going to be joining me in a couple of minutes once we go through the main stories. Tonight, Marion, our main story really will be the Scottish Government's spending review over the next 5 years, so we'll come to that shortly. But first, I'm going to update on Ukraine. This is day 97 of Vladimir Putin's illegal war in his neighbouring country. And Ukraine is still in control of some parts of the city of Severodonetsk, and its soldiers are fighting slowly advancing Russian troops, but evacuations of civilians are not possible, the head of the city's administration has said. Russians now control around half, according to reports on national television in Ukraine. Serhiy Haidai, the governor of Luhansk, said the situation is extremely complicated. Part of Severodonetsk is controlled by Russians. They cannot move freely through the city. Our fighters still remain in the settlement. EU leaders have backed a partial embargo on Russian oil after late-night talks at the summit in Brussels. The sanctions will immediately impact 75% of Russian oil imports, with the aim to ban 90% of all Russian oil imported to Europe by the end of the year. The sanctions package also includes removal of access to the SWIFT banking payments for Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, banning 3 more Russian state-owned broadcasters, and further sanctions against what the EU calls individuals responsible for war crimes in Ukraine. The first alleged case of rape by a Russian soldier has been sent to court, the Prosecutor General for Ukraine has said. The serviceman will be tried for the alleged murder of the victim's husband and sexual violence against his wife, Irina Vendiktova has said. A Ukrainian court sentenced 2 Russian soldiers who'd been captured, to 11 and a half years in jail for shelling a town in eastern Ukraine, the second war crimes verdict since the start of Russia's latest invasion in February. The Russian Ministry of Defence claims to have shot down an Su-25 aircraft of the Ukrainian Air Force and to have destroyed the Ukrainian battery of the Uragan multiple launch rocket system, the battery of the Grad multiple launch rocket system, 2 ammunition depots and a fuel depot in overnight operations. President Zelensky claims that Russia is blocking the export of 22 million tonnes of grain from Ukraine's ports and warned it posed a threat of famine. Zelensky added that the Russian forces had already stolen at least 500,000 tonnes of grain and are now looking for ways to illegally sell it somewhere. A ship loaded with metal has left the Ukrainian port of Mariupol en route to Russia, becoming the first ship to sail from that port since it was invaded by Russian forces. Ukraine said the cargo was being looted by Russia. France is set to boost military aid to Ukraine. The Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna said that France will continue to reinforce arms deliveries while visiting Kyiv on Monday. Russia will stop the supply of gas to the Netherlands as of tomorrow, after the Russian-backed trader Gasterra refused to pay the supplier Gazprom in rubles. About 44% of Dutch energy usage is based on gas, but only 15% of the Dutch gas actually comes from Russia, according to government figures. So, Marion, I'm just going straight into more detail on the EU's decision last night to impose a 90% embargo on Russian oil. So, they have agreed to that embargo on most Russian oil imports following that late-night summit talk yesterday. President of the European Council, Charles Michel, hailed the deal as a remarkable achievement after tweeting on Monday night that sanctions will immediately impact 70% of Russian oil imports, cutting a huge source of finance for its war machine. Mr. Michel added that the package also included removing access to the SWIFT payment system for Sberbank, as well as the banning of 3 broadcasters from the Russian state, as we said earlier, and further sanctions against individuals associated with war crimes. President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said the ban will effectively cut around 90% of oil imports from Russia to the EU by the end of this year, because Germany and Poland had committed to renounce deliveries via a pipeline to their territory. Von der Leyen said that the agreement on the sixth sanctions package was an important step forward, adding that the EU had agreed massive investment in renewable energy in order to compensate for diversifying away from Russian oil. The EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, later tweeted, "A landmark decision to cripple Putin's war machine. Our unity is our strength." President Volodymyr Zelensky had earlier appealed to EU leaders to show unity against Vladimir Putin. At a summit in Brussels, EU leaders had been attempting to find a way to placate the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who had been holding up a deal on the latest sanctions against Putin's war machine. Under a compromise plan that was discussed at the summit, Russian oil transported through the Soviet-era Druzhba pipeline for Hungary, the Czech Republic and Slovakia would be exempt from the EU embargo. In a press conference on Monday night, that's last night, Michel acknowledged the lack of European unity, adding, "I think that more than ever it's important to show that we are able to be strong, we are able to be firm, and that we are able to be tough in order to defend our values and our interests." Mr. Michel said that the European Council and the G7 was also ready to grant Ukraine €9 billion worth of aid for post-war reconstruction and for immediate liquidity needs. However, Frau von der Leyen warned that Ukraine needed €5 million a month just to maintain basic services and to give Ukraine a fair chance to rise from the ashes. So that's our first story tonight. So Marion Fellows, Member of Parliament for Motherwell and Wishaw. So thanks for joining us tonight from Wishaw. And so just dealing with that last question first of all, but some of these days we're going to have to get around to financing, are we? Who's going to finance the reconstruction of Ukraine? Should it be the West, the friends of Ukraine, or should the Russians be paying for it? Is it too early to discuss that kind of reparations?
I think it's a bit early to get into detailed discussions, but I think there has to be some penalty on Russia. And if that's financial for help for rebuilding Ukraine, then so be it. I think there'll have to be international agreement, of course, in order for any reparations to actually stick. We need to think about this carefully, and I think it will be the international community, but definitely charges on Russia, from my point of view, would be understandable, necessary, and a reminder that doing things like creating an illegal war costs.
Of course, one of the arguments that Russia will make, in fact, the Foreign Office spokesman was saying that last night. He was saying that, a bit cheekily, I think, these sanctions are not hurting the billionaires. They're not hurting the millionaire class which runs Russia. They're hurting the ordinary working people. I thought that was a bit of a cheeky comment, isn't it? Because as a spokesperson for Russia, he's a spokesperson for the millionaire class, isn't he?
Yes, indeed. And, we have our issues in the UK with the millionaire class of Russians as well. So I think that's right. And I think that's propaganda, because it is affecting some of the Russian billionaires, millionaires in the shorter term. They've had sanctions applied personally on them, and that's all to the good in the long run.
Yeah, but I think probably the billionaires will get by. But the other main story, of course, is the one that we've been talking about for some months now, really, which is that the European Union, of course, is actually financing Putin. They don't want to, but they've got themselves into this position that they heat their heat, their central heating and their cooking comes from Russian gas, and they just can't turn off the tap overnight, can they? Do you sympathise with people in Eastern Europe who are the main customers?
Yes, I do indeed, but I think it is a warning to us all. I mean, it's even closer to home. When you know what someone is like or what a country is capable of, is it wise to do such close links with them in terms of oil or gas or finance, in fact? And it's something that we all need to take cognizance of going forward.
So I think that's the deal then. So obviously the President Zelensky would like Europe to stop buying Russian gas tomorrow, but the fact is that Hungary particularly and a number of eastern countries mainly get gas from Russia, so they have asked for an exemption. Just finally, before we move on, the European Union appears to be committing itself now to renewables. So surely this should be a huge opportunity. This surely should be the turning point where we say that's what dependency on gas gets you. So let's just move completely onto the new industries. So is Britain anywhere near making that turning point, do you think?
Well, who knows with Boris Johnson in charge. But yes, I think we are. And I mean, Scotland's always been a game changer in that respect, because we've got such a huge range of renewable energy sources now and are working on even more. But as part of the UK, we can't fully succeed in what we're trying to do, because there's always the damper on our ability to do things without the UK government agreeing.
Well, actually, that leads into our main story tonight, because today in the Scottish Parliament, Kate Forbes, the Finance Secretary, outlined the Scottish Government's resource spending review, really covering the period for the next 5 years. And one of the main points she made is that, unlike other governments, she has to work within a framework, within an overall budget that's been set elsewhere, so her hands are tied. However, this is what Kate Forbes has told us. So in the press release, to state that an ambitious but realistic public spending framework has been published, which outlines how more than £180 billion will be invested to deliver priorities for Scotland. This resource spending review announced today is not a budget, but it's what they call a high-level set of spending estimates. It outlines how the Scottish Government will focus public finances in the coming years to tackle the 4 main priorities which Kate Forbes outlined, which are to tackle child poverty, to address the climate crisis, to strengthen the public sector after COVID, and to grow a stronger, fairer and greener economy. The targeted capital spending review has also been published to address the reduction in capital investment by the UK government. As well as supporting the NHS and affordable housing, the capital spending review will invest about £18 billion up to March 31st, 2026, with over £500 million of additional funding directed to net zero programmes. That's an addition compared to previous plans, an additional £500 million on net zero in the transition. Commenting, Kate Forbes said today, "We are, of course, still recovering from the coronavirus pandemic. There is an acute pressure on the NHS, on business and on the wider economy. The illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine is a humanitarian crisis which is affecting the global economy. Rising energy prices and constrained supply chains have affected countries worldwide." She said, while inflation is also impacting other countries, it's not impacting them equally. She says the UK currently has the highest inflation of any G7 country, almost twice the rate of France. Brexit has made this problem worse, with increasing food prices hitting the poorest hardest. We are experiencing an unprecedented cost of living crisis, with inflation at a 40-year high of 9%, facing households with considerable hardships. Kate Forbes continued, "Today's resource spending review is not a budget. However, it is essential to share high-level financial parameters with public bodies, local government and the third sector so that we can plan ahead together." She says, "Today I set out an ambitious but realistic public spending framework for the years ahead. It does not ignore the realities of our financial position, but neither does it roll back on our ambitions to change." So there's a lot in the spending review today. And one of the points, as we said at the start of this piece, one of the points that Kate Forbes made on that statement, and she also repeated it in Parliament this afternoon, is that her hands are tied. First of all, there is an overall restriction on the Scottish budget. It has to balance. Other countries don't do that. Countries can balance the budget. They can deficit spend, or they can have a surplus. But Scotland doesn't have the full levers, as she put it. So that's one of the issues that comes up, isn't it, whenever Scottish finance arises?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's no other government like the Scottish Government has to balance their budget, and have to balance a budget that they don't actually know how much they're getting. As UK government will make sudden changes to things, won't actually follow through, won't give clear guidance on Barnett consequentials or other things. And the way they've been working recently is to spend money on things like HS2, but actually reserve some of the stuff, and we're not getting the full Barnett consequentials on large infrastructure projects. And the levelling up agenda is just absolutely hammering that as well, because Scottish Government is now no longer in control of money that's being spent on capital projects in Scotland. That's very much in the remit of the UK Government, who are using it to show how much better, inverted commas, we are together
inverted commas
again.
Yeah, so again, the formula itself, as you mentioned, is a kind of a constraint on Scotland. So, yes, if spending doesn't fit into the right categories, it means Scotland doesn't get the share. Is it, by the Unionist parties who criticise Kate Forbes today, is it an attempt to force the Scottish Government to put up income tax and thus make themselves unpopular?
Well, that's the UK government and our critics' go-to phrase. Well, you can raise income tax. But when the Scottish Government tries to do stuff like defray what's happening, the punitive things that, like the bedroom tax, that comes out of our fixed budget. So we have to really be careful how and where we spend money. And it's almost a trap to say we will always increase income tax. And then if we did, then they'll come back at us. But of course, many people in Scotland pay less because of the way our income tax is structured in Scotland. So it's almost as if we can't win. But the Scottish people are actually delivering their verdict and just have in local government elections and last year in the Scottish elections as well. So I think most people in Scotland think the Scottish government's doing a good job.
Yeah, it seems to me there's a lot of confusion about tax because, as you say, the Scottish tax system is progressive, but it doesn't look that way to the Conservatives. Liz Smith for the Conservative Party said today in the Scottish Parliament, why doesn't the Scottish Government bring its tax into line with the rest of the UK? I think she meant cut tax, but it depends whose taxes you're cutting, isn't it? Because, as you say, most taxpayers in Scotland do pay less. So Scotland hasn't passed on the tax cuts for rich people. But the other point I wanted to make is that Liz Smith says that the Scottish Government hasn't got enough money. She claims that there's a budget shortfall of 4.5 billion, although that figure does not appear in the Scottish Government's estimate. That's a figure that's been in the papers today. But do the Tories really know what they're talking about here? She says, you've not got enough money, you've got to bring more money in, so why don't you cut taxes? What sort of arithmetic is Liz Smith using there?
Well, it's Tory arithmetic, it's Scottish Tory arithmetic, because they can say whatever they like. They're not government in Scotland, and they won't blame the UK government for the deficits in Scotland. They just think they're acting like an opposition party does, pronouncing on things that they, one, don't totally understand, and two, have absolutely no responsibility for.
Yep, maybe that's part of it there, not quite getting a grasp on the figures. One point, though, that was made by the Labour spokesperson today is that they didn't really get this paper. By the way, can I just show you it? I'm sure you've got yours. This is the resource spending review. 61 pages. I must admit, I haven't read all of them, but I just got this a couple of hours ago. But maybe they could have released it yesterday. So I don't know why it was kept to, apparently members of Parliament didn't get it much in advance either. But it does actually not say anything about this so-called funding gap. I don't know if you've heard about that. That figure's in the news. But I want to quote what the Fraser of Allender Institute has said on that. This is the Economics Research Group at the University of Strathclyde. And we've just received their comments on the spending review today. And they say, first of all, they welcome it, and they say they congratulate the Scottish Government for providing this sort of overall 5-year general high level, as they call it, high level look. Now, commenting, the Deputy Director of Fraser of Allender, who's David Isa, said, there's much talk about this black hole in the Scottish finances, which he says that's supposed to be the gap between what the Scottish Government wants to do and the funding available. But he says we don't really see that black hole, but nonetheless, a lot of budgets do have to be frozen. He said, now incidentally, the reason for that is Kate Forbes is prioritising social care and health and education and certain other areas. As she said, there's more money being earmarked for climate change and just transition. But what the Fraser of Allender are pointing out is that other budgets do have to be frozen, and that particularly means local government is going to have a hard time. So the overall budget for local government, for policing, for justice and higher education is not going to increase. So that actually will be a real terms cut. That's the choices you have to make in government, I guess.
That's exactly right. I mean, with a fixed budget and with inflation running at 9% and no one really expecting it to be quite as high, although we always knew that Brexit would have consequences, the war, the pandemic, all of that has helped. I mean, it's not just inflation in the UK, but as you said earlier here, we've got the highest rate. So hard choices have to be made, and it depends on your priorities. And as far as I'm concerned, things like tackling child poverty and addressing climate crisis, and actually, trying hard to keep good public service delivery going, all these things are a price worth paying for in other budgets. Though, of course, if I was someone who worked at a university or someone who ran a university, I wouldn't think that. Because everyone looks to make things better for the people that they ultimately have control over in these sectors.
Yes, I guess maybe you can make a short-term saving by not investing in more in universities, but really, if you do that for a few years, you are going to fall behind. So, but again, Kate Forbes doesn't have much room for manoeuvre at the moment. The one get out of jail would be if Scotland were able to control all of its own finances, in other words, by being an independent country. Now, we do notice in here there is 20 million for the independence referendum. Now, incidentally, the overall budget, by the way, is 180 billion.
Yes.
So that's 180,000 million, 20 million for, now to me and you, 20 million might be quite a large sum of money. But again, people, of course, unionist parties have been complaining, why is there 20 million for the referendum? So why? Is that a priority?
Well, of course, it's a small amount of money in the overall scheme of things, but it's actually a way out of Scotland not being able to do all the things that it wants to do, as any Scottish government being able to do what it wants to do, because we don't have the levers of financial power. If the UK government need more money, they can borrow. We can't. There are all sorts of barriers to Scotland actually doing exactly what it wants. So, for example, some of the investment decisions made by the UK government, like the carbon capture and storage that went south instead of coming to Aberdeen, then that really impacts on the Scottish economy, and it impacts on green energy and so forth. So 20 million in the great scheme of things is not a huge amount to be looking for a better way for Scotland to be able to raise its own money completely independently, and for it to spend its money as the Scottish government truly sees fit, because they have the powers and the levers that they can get more money into Scotland that they don't have as they're now sitting as a pocket money parliament, really, because they're given a fixed amount by the UK government. As you've already said, they have to balance their budget all the time.
Okay, and of course the referendum is a manifesto commitment also. Just before we move on, I should also underline the Kate Forbes made the point that the estimates and the general direction have been agreed between the Scottish Government and the Scottish Green Party under the Bute House Agreement. So, and both parties, of course, were elected to deliver a referendum on independence by next year. Okay, we better move on. There are other stories. Now, unfortunately, the next one is about Boris Johnson facing mounting calls for a confidence vote. Have I not done this before? In his leadership, that could put his position under threat within days, as two more MPs suggested that they had lost faith in the government. The former Cabinet Minister Andrea Leadsom criticised Johnson's failure of leadership, as she put it, the latest in a string of senior Tory figures to express doubts about the Prime Minister's future. The former business secretary, who has twice run for party leadership, stopped short of calling for Mr Johnson to resign, but said individual MPs would decide on how best to restore confidence. In a letter to her constituents, Ms Leadsom said she believed it was extremely unlikely that senior leaders were unaware of what was going on. I take it she's referring to the parties. She says, I agree with Sue Gray's conclusions that there have been significant failures of leadership, both political and official, at Number 10 and in the Cabinet Office. That's what she wrote to her constituents. She is the MP for South Northamptonshire, and she added, each of my Conservative MP colleagues and I must now decide individually on what the right course of action is to restore confidence in our government. Leadsom's comments came as John Stevenson, the MP for Carlisle, went further and said that today he had added his name to those writing to Sir Graham Brady, who's the chair of the 1922 committee, to call for a confidence vote. On Monday, the first day of the parliamentary recess, 4 other MPs called on Johnson to resign or to call for a vote of confidence in himself. Those 4 included Jeremy Wright, a former Attorney General. Several Tory MPs have said they believe the threshold of 54 letters withdrawing support from the Prime Minister was close to being crossed, or may have been already. This would trigger a secret ballot on whether they still have confidence in the Prime Minister. At least 30 MPs have said the Prime Minister should resign or else call a vote of confidence in himself, but they have not committed to that in public. Okay, so, well, first, quick one. Do you have any rumours of how many Conservative MPs have written a letter?
Well, I don't have any inside information on that, Hugh, but there's been an awful lot of Tory MPs gathering in corners, gathering in corridors, in members' lobby after votes. Normally people disperse very quickly with little knots of Tories all over the Palace of Westminster talking amongst themselves. And it's been quite interesting because the range of MPs who have publicly announced that they're putting up a letter to Sir Graham Brady it is quite diverse. I mean, there's some new MPs in seats in the south, some MPs in seats in the north, some MPs that you would almost expect to put in a letter of no confidence, and they range from right-wing Tories to centrists to possibly not quite left-wing, because there's no such thing really as a left-wing Tory, but more on the left of the Tory party. So it seems to be not just one type of Tory MP, and that's even more dangerous for Boris Johnson. And I read something today that said, that there doesn't seem to be a concerted driver anywhere. There's not one person or one group leading this. It's not the ERG, it's not Steve Baker, it's different people. And that is much more dangerous for Boris Johnson, because it's coming out of a belief, probably, that Boris Johnson won't get them re-elected, and they need to get someone else in place sooner rather than later.
Well, that's what does it. Perhaps what they're waiting for is these two by-elections, which are coming up in the next few weeks, and both in England. So if he loses both of them, I think probably the Prime Minister would be finished. If he wins them, he might carry on for a bit longer. But I suppose my final point before we move on, my final question is, what actual difference would it make to Scotland? To some extent, we are bystanders. Very few Conservative MPs were elected in Scotland, 6, I think. And they are now the third party here following the elections that you mentioned earlier on, the council elections. So does it actually make a lot of difference to Scotland? Who's running the Conservative Party down south?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, if Boris Johnson goes, we'll have to really size up who takes his place. And that's a problem for the Tory party, because they don't really have an obvious candidate in place. They've rejected Jeremy Hunt already, and they're not usually keen on going back on losers. But no, not really, because no matter who the leader is and has been the leader, we haven't voted for a Tory government for 60 years. So Boris, I suppose there's a bit of me that says Boris is really unpopular in Scotland in a way that he has never been unpopular in England. And if you take the cab driver survey, they all used to love him, and then now they didn't, and then they went back again, and now they're convinced that he's not going to win for the Tories, so he's better out. It's a really interesting question, and of course once Douglas Ross makes up his mind about whether to support Boris or not, we might get a better idea of whether it will have a huge effect on Scotland or not.
Maybe Douglas Ross is just playing his cards right. He might want to go for the job himself. Okay, we must move on now. Next story, UK Civil Service has paused its flagship graduate recruitment scheme for at least a year, as they intend to reduce the overall numbers of the staff. The scheme, known as the Civil Service Fast Stream, will not run in 2023 as it has in previous years. The decision was made at a Cabinet Office board meeting on the 19th of May, chaired by Stephen Barclay, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. This move comes after the UK government said it wanted to cut 91,000 civil service roles in order to save money. The Civil Service Fast Stream is made up of 15 individual schemes, and graduates who have at least a degree of 2-2, a second-class degree, are able to apply. Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, had sent a letter to civil servants in which he acknowledged that although the job cuts would be challenging, the civil service staffing levels had risen significantly since 2016, partly due to the coronavirus pandemic. In 2016, the UK employed the fewest civil servants since World War II. 384,000. But due to Brexit, that number rose to 475,000 by the end of 21. The UK government also said it had not completely ruled out the recruitment freeze or compulsory redundancies in order to reduce overall staffing levels. However, the decision to pause the civil service fast stream has faced criticism. The biggest civil service union warned of potential strike action after plans for job cuts were announced, with Mark Savotka, the General Secretary of the Public Commercial Services Union, that's the PCS, saying that the civil service had reached a tipping point and that a national strike action was realistic. So this is mainly UK civil servants. The Scottish Government itself also employs civil servants. And by the way, that is also one, let's be honest about it here, Kate Forbes did say there will have to be efficiency cuts in Scotland, and I think she wants to reduce the whole size of public sector employment in Scotland. This isn't really is it? Do you agree with me? This isn't really a brush to attack the Tories with, because we have to do it also.
Yes, but it's how you do it is the important thing, I think. A government minister or secretary going around putting notes on people's desks saying, where are you? I was here, where were you? And actually how you treat people while they're working for you is an entirely different thing. I mean, you can reduce by natural, I hate to use the term natural wastage, we're talking about people, but you don't fill vacancies, which is one of the ways that Kate Forbes describes in the review. You don't just stop things dead, because it's a retrograde step. There's not a huge number of jobs in the graduate programme, maybe about 1,000, I think, but it's indicative of the panic that Whitehall's facing. I mean, it was Whitehall that increased the number of civil servants, and that was because of Brexit mainly. Yes, the pandemic as well. But what they did during the pandemic was they shuffled around a lot of civil servants from one department to another. So, for example, from child maintenance service in DWP into universal credit. So that's how they did it. But they also, because of Brexit, had to employ far more civil servants to run customs and all the other issues that the fact they've put in British business because of leaving the European Union. If you want to cut public service jobs, then you have to do it in a way that actually doesn't just become ideological. And that's often the way this Tory government does things. Someone makes a decision, it would be a good thing to do this, and they don't look at unintended consequences, and they don't look at the human aspect of what they're doing. And I don't think you can accuse the Scottish Government of acting in exactly that manner.
I think it was a couple of weeks ago when I was waiting for the bus home after the studio, I saw a sign at the bus stop, an advert by the UK government saying how many civil servants they employ in Scotland. So they might have to take that advert down. I forget what it was, but I think they said something like 30,000 civil service jobs in Scotland because of the union.
Yeah, well, when they have something that they can beat us over the head with in terms of unionism, they'll use that. But you're right, that advert will have to be taken down sooner rather than later if they're employed by the UK government.
Aye, okay, so thanks, Marion. So let's move on to our next story, and back to the economy. A new report has cited a decade of UK government cuts as the principal reason for the life expectancy of Scots being lower than expected. Dr. David Walsh is a co-author of a report by the Glasgow University and the Glasgow Centre for Population Health. He said these tragic consequences are, this is his words, principally the result of the UK government austerity policies that have squeezed billions of pounds from public services and social security and have had a devastating impact in the lives of so many in our communities. A report has been branded the crisis of the UK government's making by Chris Burt, who's the Associate Director for Scotland at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and the findings have been described as shameful but not surprising by Dr. Andrea Williamson, who is a Deep End GP in Glasgow. Deep End is a project of doctors and other professionals who work in the most deprived areas. Dr. Williamson went on to say that on a daily basis we see patients who simply don't have enough money to live on. money to heat their home, to feed themselves once their kids are fed, or to pay the bus fare to visit their family. Commenting on the report, the SNP's member of the Scottish Parliament, Eleanor Whittam, said, "Over a decade of brutal Tory austerity, this utterly damning report must make Boris Johnson and his Tory government wake up to the devastating impact they're having. They should be deeply ashamed of the damage they are causing. The Tories have been warned time and time again about the inescapable tragic human cost of the cruel Westminster austerity agenda, but we have been ignored and dismissed at every turn. This needs to be a turning point." Austerity, whoever thought that austerity was a way of improving the economy, Marion? How can making people poor possibly be good for them or for the economy in general?
David Cameron and George Osborne started it with great glee. And they never ever looked at the human cost of what they were doing. It was a way of making themselves look good, balancing their books when they didn't have to be as brutal about it, and putting people who were already under the cosh further into poverty. I mean, food banks have exploded in use, and it's going to get worse. There's an absolute failure to understand in the UK government how real people live. What an impact, for example, inflation is having on people. When you spend more than 10% of your income on food, and you have to pay high rents, and you have a fixed income, all of that really mitigates against you, and it leads to ill health, it leads to mental health issues, all of that. And I think that for me, there were two occasions when I was sitting on those famous green benches. And funnily enough, it was both women, and I found that really much more difficult to take. The first time was when a Tory woman MP said, "Why don't people on benefits save?" And she meant it. Where do you go with someone who thinks like that? And another one was during the pandemic, when we were talking about sickness, statutory sick pay. And she thought that the weekly rate, which is just over £90, was a daily rate. And she thought that was okay. And I'm taking these two sort of out of context, but government ministers are pretty much the same. They don't understand that if people are out of work, they should be supported to live like decent human beings in a decent fashion. They shouldn't be forced to go to food banks. They shouldn't have the benefits capped because they've decided. I mean, what happened during the pandemic was lots more people went on to universal credit than was ever the case before, and many of them had 3 children. Now they didn't think, when they had their children, that one day I might be on benefits, but that didn't matter because they were only getting the payments that covered 2 children, because that's the cap that the Tories have put on. And it's a total failure to understand the true cost of living if you're poor. And I think last week, the week before we went on in recess, when Keir Starmer, for example, asked Boris Johnson, how are you going to help this guy who's on overnight dialysis? What are you going to do to help him? Because his electricity costs are going to go through the roof. And Boris Johnson had no answer. Now, because Sue Gray brought out reports, suddenly we miraculously had the Chancellor out giving away billions of pounds, as they see it, double counting in some cases. But it's an absolute failure at the heart of Tory ideology, because they do not understand the true cost of living for some people. They cannot perceive of a world where you can't afford to eat. You have to walk for miles because you can't afford your bus fare, and you have to go without so your children get some food. And that's why, the Marcus Rashford stuff down south, that's why they still don't want to do things like feed children during school holidays, which is an absolute piece of nonsense.
Yep,
Sorry, I get quite worked up when I think about this.
Well, that's there's a certain type of attitude, as you say, that you've got to expect. That's what's going to happen if you elect a Tory government. That's their view of the world. Not elected in Scotland, of course. Now, let's move on to the next story, also in the economy. This one is about the Scottish foreign direct investment, that is to say, companies from outside Scotland investing in plant and businesses in the Scottish territory. And the Scottish figures outperform the UK as a whole. Scotland has recorded a 14% increase in FDI, that's foreign direct investment into the economy. That's based on figures from Ernst & Young up to the end of 2021. That's in the latest annual attractiveness survey. Figures published today showed the significant level of investment as compared to an increase in FDI of 1.8% across the UK and 5.4% across Europe. Let me just remind myself, the figure is 14% for Scotland. The latest survey results show Scotland's perceived attractiveness to investors now sits at a record high. That's at 15.8% of investors rating it as the UK's most attractive FDI location. That's up from 15% last year and more than doubling its rating from the pre-pandemic period because it was rated at 7% in 2019. Other key findings from the survey results include that 3 Scottish cities, Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen, remain in the top 10 locations outside of London for attracting inward investment projects. Edinburgh, alongside Manchester, is ranked equal first, with Dundee and Livingston also making it to the top 20. Scotland performed strongly in high-value, high-growth industries like digital and utilities, alongside a rebound in manufacturing FDI. The 4 leading sectors were digital technology, that's with 33 projects, utility supply, 18 projects, business and professional services, 14 projects, and machinery equipment, also 14 projects. Digital projects in Scotland rose by 73.4% in contrast to a 7% decline in Europe and 7% growth in the UK overall. Scotland is now firmly established as the UK's number 2 location for digital projects behind London. Ivan McKee, who's the Scottish Trade Minister, said, "It's great to see these latest results which show Scotland leading the UK when it comes to securing foreign direct investment, in spite of the significant challenges posed by Brexit and the pandemic. That's testament to our skills base and our highly qualified workforce. We have been the most successful region or nation in the UK outside London for 9 of the last 11 years and for the 7th year running in attracting FDI." Okay, so it looks like, Marion, these investors from overseas coming to Scotland, they maybe are not too panicked by the prospect of a Scottish independence referendum next year.
No, they come for what Ivan McKee has described as the skills base we have in Scotland and our highly educated workforce. Now, if we'd listened to England and Scottish Tories, if we'd listened to them, we were getting pelted because apparently, we didn't have enough folk going to university and our education system is in bits and isn't it all woe is me. And these investors don't see Scotland like that because it isn't like that. We have a good skills base and we have one of the most highly educated workforces in the Western world. And that's why we're getting so much. Also, I remember talking to the CEO of a large pharmaceutical company a few years ago, and what he said was the difference between talking to the Scottish government and the UK government was night and day. In Scotland, they're more agile. You can get directly through to a minister. In England, you have to go through so many hoops and barriers to actually get to speak to someone who can make a decision that it's off-putting. And I think that is also part of what is attracting folk to Scotland, because we are a small country and have a government that's focused on making things better for the whole population, we can adapt and change and make things happen much, much more quickly.
Yeah, it's the Northern European model, isn't it? Scotland's a similar
Yes,
size to quite a lot of very successful Northern European economies. Maybe it's best to be small. I don't know if there's been any analysis, but certainly decision-making is quicker. Yeah.
Especially in education. When I was on the Education Committee in Westminster, we've got 32 local authorities. There are hundreds in England, and because of their very I don't know what the word, fractured system. They have all sorts of different models between academies and local authorities and multi-academy trusts. It's quite difficult to actually educate everyone to the same standard in a
Yes,
system like that.
I don't even know
In Scotland, we don't
what
need
those
that.
academies mean. By the way,
Yeah.
just before we move on, something that's often underrated is that, in fact, you can get a university degree in Motherwell, although Motherwell hasn't got a university. But as you know, of course, students are on degree courses in New College, Lanarkshire, validated
Yes.
by other Scottish universities. So that probably is understated, but I think something like half of Scottish adults have a university level qualification. So we're a
You're talking to
well-educated
someone who
lot.
worked as an
Right.
FE lecturer for many years, and the way that we get people into university is quite different in many cases. We have access to higher education courses in FE colleges, and for years those people who went that way, not through other routes, weren't actually being counted in the population for universities. So, yeah.
Yep, so we are. I might not look like it, but we are a well-educated bunch generally, right? So, next story now. Unfortunately, we have to talk again about the horrible shooting in Uvalde, Texas last week, because Andy Murray has made a comment on it. He said that the mass shooting last week in Uvalde, Texas, made him angry, and that a survivor's account of the incident was similar to his own experience in the 1996 massacre at Dunblane. An 18-year-old gunman armed with a semi-automatic rifle stormed an elementary school in Texas last week, killing 19 children and 2 teachers. The attack, 10 days after a shooting in Buffalo, New York State, that left 10 people dead, has intensified the long-standing national debate over US gun laws. Mr. Murray said, "It's unbelievably upsetting and it makes you angry. I think there's been over 200 mass shootings in America this year and nothing changes," said Andy Murray. "I can't understand that. My feeling is that surely at some stage you have to do something different. You can't keep approaching the problem by buying more guns and having more guns in the country. I don't see how that solves it. But I could be wrong. Let's try something different and see if you get a different outcome." Andy Murray was, of course, a student at Dunblane Primary when a gunman killed 16 pupils and a teacher before killing itself. It was the deadliest mass shooting in the UK's modern history. Murray went on to say, "I heard something on the radio the other day and it was a child from that school. I experienced a similar thing when I was at Dunblane, a teacher coming out and waving all the children under tables and telling them to go and hide. And it was a kid telling exactly the same story about how she survived it. They were saying they go through these drills as young children. How is that normal that children should be having to go through drills in case someone comes into school with a gun?" Well, of course, to us and to practically anyone in Europe, it just seems completely nuts that America tries to deal with gun problems by having more guns, because that's, in fact, more or less what former President Trump said last week in Texas, just a few days after. But how can you change the American gun culture?
Ban the NRA. The National Rifle Association funds so many congressmen, senators, that they have a huge influence on the UK, on the US, US Senate and House of Congress. It's absolutely incredible that they are allowed. But the way that US elections are financed is totally different from here, and there are no limits, and there are all sorts of other issues. There are perhaps some limits, but actually, it's this idea that the right to bear arms is in the Constitution. And it just, I think the saddest thing I heard was a teacher being interviewed on television in Texas, in Uvalde, who said that, I think the answer is to arm teachers. I don't know how you do it, Hugh. I wish I did. I'd tell them. But I think it's a complete culture change that is needed. And even if the president was to say, right, we're going to do this, we're going to ban this, the state system really doesn't allow the president to make laws for the entire United States. There are ways around, and we see that with the abortion stuff that's going on there just now. I don't know where this is, because if the site of children being killed by an 18-year-old gunman who couldn't buy a pistol, I heard, but could buy an automatic machine gun. It makes no sense. I don't even know where you would start there. But
Yeah.
it needs to be the American people themselves that actually see that. If you ever watch Bowling for Columbine, and you have the states bordering on Canada, they don't have these mass shootings in Canada, and they go hunting, shooting, and fishing, and they have guns, but it's just a different mindset altogether.
Yes, I know the film you're referring to, Bowling for
Yeah,
Columbine, was by Michael Moore. I have seen that.
yeah,
Yeah, he does make that contrast. Incidentally, the strange thing about Michael Moore, who's a well-known left-wing commentator, is in that film he says that he himself was a member of the NRA, and it's partly in country areas. I suppose it is hunting and shooting, as you say. I heard a fella the other day on the radio saying that Finland has got almost as many guns per head as America, but it's just for hunting. It's just for country purposes. You don't take them to school, for goodness sake. But although they've got the same number of guns, but completely different culture. But no, again, I was hoping you would have the answer. No, nobody knows how to change that. But certainly the political influence of the NRA is enormous.
yeah,
Most American people would support a ban or some sort of restriction on guns anyway.
yeah.
But they've just not been able to, as you say, Marion, force it through Congress yet. Incidentally, Andy Murray said, I think there's been 200 shootings this year. I don't know if that's correct. But one thing I do know, we read it out last week, is that gun violence is the biggest killer of children in America. That became the case a couple of years ago, so that is a fact. So let's move on to our penultimate story tonight. Low emission zones, LEZs, in town centres and cities. To protect public health and to improve air quality, LEZs have now been formally introduced across Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dundee and Aberdeen. Plans have been agreed at local authority level and have now also been approved by Scottish ministers, as required in legislation through the Transport Scotland Act of 2019. With the shape and scope of the LEZs now agreed across the 4 cities through this introduction, a local grace period has now begun until the enforcement is in place. In Glasgow, the LEZ already applies to buses. For other vehicle types, enforcement comes in on the 1st of June next year, 1st of June 2023. But for residents who live within the zone, it'll be 1st of June 2024. Edinburgh will also commence its enforcement on June 24, and Dundee will bring it in May, 30th of May 24, Aberdeen again on the 1st of June 2024. The LEZs set an emissions limit for certain road spaces, restricting adverts for the most polluting vehicles in order to improve air quality. This helps to protect public health within our towns and cities, making them more attractive places in which to live and work or to visit. LEZs also encourage people to think about leaving the car at home and to consider public transport or active travel, supporting climate action by helping to meet Scotland's world-leading commitment to reduce car kilometres travelled by 20% by the year 2030. Vehicles that do not meet the emission standards set for the low emission zone will not be able to drive in that zone, and a penalty charge will be payable by the registered keeper of a vehicle if a non-compliant vehicle does enter the LEZ. The minimum emission standards for vehicles permitted within the 4 EZs are Euro 4, that's the European emissions level number 4 for petrol cars and vans, generally vehicles registered from since January 2006. So that means generally newer cars should meet the Euro 4 regulations, and Euro 6 for diesel cars and vans. Generally that means any diesel vehicles which have been registered since 2015. A number of vehicles are exempt from LEZ requirements, including any vehicle driven by a blue badge holder. Funding remains available to help people and businesses that need it most to comply with the low emission zones, and full information is available at low emission zones, www.lowemissionzones.scot. So I looked this up, Marion. So Euro 4 means a petrol vehicle has to emit no more than 1 gram of CO, 1 gram of carbon monoxide per kilometre driven, and also I think 0.8 of a gram of NOx. So these are of course poisonous and can cause breathing difficulties. So it's important to keep the air quality low in towns. Pollution low in towns. Is that a good move? There's obviously a downside
yes,
to
I
some
think so.
people.
there are always downsides when you introduce legislation like this. But if we're serious, and we're serious about lowering our carbon emissions, this is the kind of thing that we have to do. And the active travel thing is really important, and also getting more people to use buses or to use trains or to use other modes of transport. I mean, even here in Wishaw, I'm reliably informed by the CEO of North Lanarkshire Council that I'll soon be able to cycle safely to my office in Motherwell. And I quite look forward to that day. At the moment, I wouldn't try it. It's a busy road, and I'm not that good in a set of two wheels. But I think it's really important that we look to the future. We can't keep saying things about lowering our carbon emissions and a green future and doing all of that unless we actually do things like these low emission zones in towns. And I'm not in Glasgow as much as I used to be, Hugh, but I can remember what it was like in Hope Street when all those buses were chugging up. And as you say, they introduced steps to reduce the carbon emissions from buses in Glasgow because it was actually dangerous for anyone who was walking up the street rather than being on the bus or even in the bus. It was dangerous because people were breathing in really nasty toxins. So we need to be serious. If it's going to be serious about it, this is exactly the kind of thing that we need to actually introduce and see done. Properly. There are some compensations available, and the blue badge holders will be okay. But absolutely, it's the right thing to do.
Yep, but generally, of course, most people with modern vehicles will probably find they fit the Euro 6 or Euro 4 requirements. Anyway, right, final story, let me just move on. This comes back to what we said earlier on, actually, about universities. Scotland is continuing to set the pace when it comes to students from deprived areas getting into university, according to the Commissioner for Fair Access. The Commissioner's latest annual report says the Scottish Government's approach has been an unambiguous success, and that all the fair access indicators are flashing green, despite the impact of COVID-19. It marks Sir Peter Scott's last report as Commissioner for Fair Access before he steps down. A record of 16.7% of students from Scotland's most deprived 20% of communities were entrants in full-time first degree courses in year 2020, an increase of 545 students compared with the previous year. This represents an increase of around 1,550 entrants, that's 39%, during Sir Peter's time as Commissioner. Scotland has already reached the interim target that by 21, 16% of new entrants to full-time degree courses should come from the 20% most deprived communities. So that target has been reached. This target rises to 18% by 2026. And a final target of 27%, which should be a level playing field, should be achieved by 2030. Higher Education Minister Jamie Hepburn said, the Commissioner for Fair Access makes it clear that Scotland continues to set the pace in the UK in terms of fair access to higher education, with a record number of Scottish students from deprived areas enrolling in university for the first time. So it's good to have good news stories, a policy that's been outlined for over a number of years now. That's beginning to work, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and I think it's really important. I mean, if we give our children ambition, then there's no limits to what they can do, and I think it's really important that it's important that every child is able to access further and higher education, because that opens doors. I'm the result of, my parents were very, very progressive back in the day. They vowed that if they had any children, they would get the education that they hadn't been able to get. And that's why I went to university first in a family way, way back, and I won't say when. But it's really important for Scotland because we've seen the benefits there. The investors are coming to Scotland because we have high educational attainment, and we need to spread that. And I have to say that I'm really proud of this SNP Scottish Government with things like baby boxes and child payments and doing their level best to level the playing field for children who live in deprived areas and who in the past have not had the opportunities to do the kind of things that was taken for granted in our middle class, areas. East Renfrewshire, for example. Why shouldn't someone from Motherwell or Wishy, or someone from Craignute in my constituency have the same ability and chance to go to university as someone from Bearsden, because they're every bit as clever.
Yep.
They just need the opportunity.
That's right, opportunity, or even somebody from Paisley to go to that extent. Well, that's a good news story to end up on tonight. So thank you for watching, and thank you especially to Marion Fellows. Once again, it's been a pleasure to talk to you tonight over in Wishy Area. So I hope I hope you'll have an opportunity to speak to us again once you're back down the road. And that's it for tonight. So thank you all for watching. Can I just remind you all that we're a volunteer service. We do hope to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, and we hope to be able to present more news and other special programmes, and we will do that as soon as we can increase our funding. So you are probably our source of funding at the moment, so thank you if you're one of our supporters. If you'd like to join us, please look at the website on your screen, and if you click on the donate button, it really would be great if you start a direct debit. No matter how small, anything else that comes in helps us to make more programmes. We do have big bills to pay, and we don't actually have enough coming in now, so we really do need to increase our funding. So please help if you can, and if you can't afford to increase your spending on us, then please pass us on through Twitter or other social media and get more people watching, because we do have excellent guests like Marion Fellows on several times a week. So thank you again to Marion, and thank you for watching. I'll be back with Scotland at 7 tomorrow. Goodbye now.